Thank you very much indeed, David. It's really an honor and a privilege to be asked to give this lecture, particularly on the 20th anniversary of Olof Palme's tragic assassination. And it's a joy to see so many people here tonight who are interested in this topic and in many ways indirectly interested in the extraordinary work that he did. I think many people feel that Olof Palme was one of a generation of people who were simultaneously mainstream politicians but people of vision and wisdom. People like Willy Brandt, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and a number of others. And I feel and I think many people feel that we really sadly lack such people of vision in political circles at the present time. So it really is an honor to be here tonight. I would like to concentrate, if I may, on the developments of recent years, but I'd like to start, I think, by going back, in fact, to not so much the period at the time of which Olof Palme was assassinated, but actually 10 years before that, because if we go back not to 1986, but to 1976, that was the year in which Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States, and towards the end of that decade, the 1970s, we really entered the period in which the Cold War assumed probably its most dangerous period, apart from the period around the late 1950s and early 1960s, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you remember, those of you who can remember back to that time, towards the end of the 1970s, there was a very powerful move in the United States to see United States rearmed. And this coincided almost with the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, with the hostage crisis and the Iranian Revolution, and with the development of a range of new, very dangerous long-range weapon systems like the MX, which incredibly eventually got the name of Peacekeeper, Trident, cruise missiles, Pershing II, the Soviet SS-20s and SS-18s. It was a time of real worry, and when Ronald Reagan came to power in 1980-81, you had the term the evil empire coined, and we entered a period which is probably the most dangerous we've seen through, apart from that October-November 1962. And it was at that time that Olof Palme was leading this commission which published its report on common security in 1982, which tried to break through this logjam in East-West relations and pointed to the common demands for security across the world. It was a very brave move, and I think one has to say that at the time it was quite largely ignored by governments, but not by people across Europe and across the wider world. And I think also, looking back on it, it was probably influential in the very important changes that were beginning to take place in the Soviet Union, 1982, 3, 4, and 5, and so on, with Gorbachev coming in 1985. I was very lucky. I went to Moscow twice in 85 and 86 and could see the changes starting to take place. I think one of the tragedies is that when Gorbachev was trying to make those changes, it took 2 precious years before Western politicians really started to respond. 2 real lost years in East-West relations, and possibly lost years for a more peaceful transition within the Soviet Union. But be that as it may, Olof Palme was incredibly important at that time, and really he acted as a kind of focus for looking at things a different way. And I think that is really what we have to do at the present time, because once again, we are in a very dangerous period. I noticed just a couple of weeks ago when Donald Rumsfeld was introducing the new quadrennial defense review, the 4-year program for the US Armed Forces, the way he tended to use the phrase, we are now, quotes, in the long war. We were in the Cold War, we're now in the long war. And that now is the phrase that is beginning to stick in American military circles. This is a long-term conflict and must be seen primarily as a military conflict against an enemy. And I think in many ways that period in the late 1970s has an extraordinary echo with what happened in American politics in the late 1990s. If you recall then, there were groups very similar to the very active right-wing groups in the 1970s that were advocating the concept of the new American century, that the 21st century would be the new American century. And you had groups such as the Committee on the Present Danger redeveloped, Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and many others saying that the United States had an historic role, really, now that it was the world's sole superpower, to bring civilized values, as it was seen, to the whole world community. Rather like the Britain of the 1890s and Pax Britannica. But it was very strong, and in a sense, many people did not take it too seriously. And I think one point must be made at this point. As soon as you talk about what is called the neoconservative group within American politics, one has to remember that very many people across the United States, including people right across politics do not take this view. But the point is that the groups who were behind this kind of thinking came in very strongly with George Bush in November 2000, as the administration was formed in January 2001, in much the same way that the ideologues of the 1970s came in with Ronald Reagan. And what was expected then to be maybe a rather quieter presidency once he was in did not go like that, and we had the evil empire and everything else. And the similar kind of thing happened only 5 years or so ago. When George Bush came in early 2001, there was a widespread expectation, I think, that essentially he would run something of a consensus presidency because it had been such a narrow victory, combination of the Florida Chads and the Supreme Court. But essentially, that was mistaken from the start. And what you saw was the rise of what at the time was called American unilateralism, a very vigorous view that the United States did have this unique role to play in the world. And it was almost with religious fervor on occasions. And I think the feeling was that now that the evil empire, the Soviet Union, had been consigned to the dustbin of history, there was surely only one political and economic system that would work, and that was essentially the American style of politics, and what was good for the White House was good for the world. As I say, this was not common right across the political spectrum in the United States, but essentially the neoconservatives, as they are still called, were there right in positions of power. And if you remember the early months of 2001, you had, to the surprise of many European governments, let alone Europeans, you had actually a series of moves which were clearly very unilateral and very independently minded. And essentially, it was born partly through the feeling that the United States was there, it was the key state, but also partly because of a possible sense of vulnerability. I remember the way this was put, in fact, by George Bush himself during the election campaign before he was elected. And he used his rather inimitable style to actually look at the Cold War era compared with the new era we were in. He put it this way: it was a dangerous world, and we knew exactly who the they were, the Soviets. It was us versus them, and we knew exactly who them was. Today, we're not so sure who the they are, but we know they're there. And in a sense, I think there was that unease at the same time as a real feeling that now was the extraordinary opportunity. And you saw in the months that followed, through the spring and summer of 2001, opposition to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the idea that the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty should be consigned to history, opposition to the UN plans for an international criminal court, opposition to talks about preventing the weaponization of space, even problems with the attempts by the UN to get better control of the transfer of light arms. For my own mind, I think one of the most dangerous things was actually to give up on the very important negotiations to try and strengthen the Biological Weapons Treaty. And that largely has been lost, even though it was desperately needed. For European governments, it was the withdrawal of the Kyoto Protocols, the withdrawal from those protocols, which I think was most significant. That was really unexpected. But what it meant was that by July and August of 2001, within the United States, there was this strong view in government circles, if not across the country as a whole, that things were really going their way. I was struck particularly by a quote from Charles Krauthammer, who I think is one of the best writers, a neoconservative himself, a regular writer in the Weekly Standard. And he actually put it this way when looking about whether the United States should go for a multipolar or unipolar attitude. And he said, multipolarity, yes, when there is no alternative, but not when there is. Not when we have the unique imbalance of power that we enjoy today and that has given the international system a stability and essential tranquility that it has not known for at least a century. The international environment is far more likely to enjoy peace under a single hegemon. Moreover, we are not just any hegemon, we run a uniquely benign imperium. Now, that was in the first week of July 2001, and 2 months later came 9/11. And essentially, I think it is still important for people outside the United States to recognize the significance of that. Just think back to that particular day. When the first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center, within minutes, local television stations were showing it live, showing the burning building. And within just 10 or 20 minutes, it was being shown live right across the United States. Tens of millions of Americans and many people across the world saw the second plane hit the South Tower and watched in horror nearly an hour later when first the southern and then northern towers collapsed. And it wasn't just that this was any building. The World Trade Center was almost the iconic image of international business success. And then the Pentagon was hit as well. although there was a much smaller loss of life, for the American military, that was almost as significant. So it was a real shock to what appeared to be things going right. My friend and colleague Malcolm Dando, who'd worked a lot in the United States, said to me the first time we met, a day or so later, he said, "Paul, you know, the real significance of this is that this will mean the Hawks do whatever they want. And that is the response you're going to have to watch." Now, there was huge support for the United States immediately afterwards. I think it was Le Mans in Paris which said "we are all Americans now." And essentially, there was pretty widespread support for the intervention in Afghanistan, the termination of the Taliban regime, which were presumed to be the sponsors indirectly of 9/11 through their associations with the al-Qaeda movement. And essentially, there was pretty widespread support for that, maybe not wholly, but what changed quite perceptibly month by month was the early months of 2002. Firstly, the State of the Union speech when Mr. Bush announced the idea of the axis of evil, not the evil empire now, but 20 or so years later, the axis of evil. And this was essentially directed not at terror groups, so-called, but at countries which were rogue states and might possibly sponsor terror, but were clearly going to develop weapons of mass destruction. So it was extending the war on terror well beyond the original idea that many Europeans had expected. And then 3 months later came the West Point speech, which really hardened the attitude of preempting threats, if need be, by taking military action. I remember vividly being at a conference in Washington in March 2002, where the mood was already one of we must now go for Iraq. We've sorted out Afghanistan, now it's Iraq's turn. And there was talk also about possibly North Korea in due course. I remember actually having lunch with a group of people, including some neoconservatives, one of whom had been in the Bush transition team. And we got to talking about Iraq, and I said, look, can people not see the danger of trying to do that by force and what it would lead to across the Middle East? And the guy looked at me almost pityingly and said, you don't seem to get it, Paul. If we get Iraq right, we won't have to go for Iran. And the point there was that Iran was always the greater problem from the American perception. And essentially, if you were to have a quiet Iraq with American troops there and with a pro-American, if you like, a client government, then essentially the Iranians would behave themselves. And that stuck with me right through. It was, in fact, some time later, it was nearly a year later, that the war with Iraq started. And many people think that a lot of that had to do with the influence of politicians trying to persuade the United States to go through the United Nations. There may have been an element of that, but in fact, there was a very significant military reason. And that is that the intensive bombing campaign in Afghanistan had exhausted the US Air Force and Navy of virtually all its precision-guided munitions. And it took nearly a year to build new sets of munitions to use against Iraq. That was one of the key reasons why they actually waited until March of 2003. If we go on then and look both at Afghanistan and Iraq and indeed the wider al-Qaeda movement and see what it means and see whether we really are set for a long war, I think it's worth just pointing out some of the developments there. For Afghanistan itself, many people argue, and I think with a good amount of sense, if you turn the whole thing around and look at it from the al-Qaeda movement, quite probably the attacks in New York and Washington were intended to incite the United States to take ground force action in Afghanistan. In other words, to intervene with large numbers of ground troops, and then there would be the setting for a long-term guerrilla war involving the Taliban, al-Qaeda militia, much as the Mujahideen had actually targeted the Soviets 20 years previously. The Americans did not do it that way. If that was the al-Qaeda motive, they got it wrong. Because essentially the Americans used a combination of special forces, intensive bombing, and crucially, rearming the Northern Alliance to retilt the balance of the Afghan civil war against the Taliban. Ironically, the Northern Alliance was rearmed largely by the Russians, paid for by the Americans. And from their perspective, it worked. But remember, the Taliban were not defeated as such for the most part. They melted away when it was obvious to them that they could not maintain control of most of the country that they controlled. And I think the essential point here is that this meant that in the longer term, if Afghanistan could not get the kind of aid and help immediately to get a secure environment, the Taliban would return. You may remember one of the best of the UN diplomats, Lakhdar Brahimi, saying just after the end of the Taliban regime that what was needed was a major peacekeeping force of at least 30,000 people to help the country stabilize and help it make its own transition to a more peaceful society. That never came. And the end result was that within 2 years, the guerrilla war began to reassert itself. And now, nearly 5 years later, 4.5 years later, we have 20,000 American combat troops in Afghanistan fighting a guerrilla war, which hardly ever gets into the media. And you have all the problems in the country itself. George Bush may spend 4 hours there today, as he did, but the reality, if you talk to any people who served there, either in NGOs or in the military in recent months, the situation is actually deteriorating. And then what of al-Qaeda itself, the movement itself? Well, essentially, there has been incredibly strong action in many parts of the world by the United States and by some of its allies and coalition partners. And essentially, that is a movement which, to all intents and purposes, should no longer exist. Many of the leaders have been killed or detained. There have been thousands upon thousands of detentions, some of them for very long periods of time. Yet at the same time, this is a movement which is as active as ever and probably has more support than it had 4 or 5 years ago. If you just think of all the different incidents of recent years, and I'm not just talking about London and Madrid and Bali and Jakarta and Istanbul and many different places, Casablanca, Tunisia, Riyadh, Egypt, time and time again, even down in Kenya, you actually see that the movement in its different ways has been more active in the last 4 years than in the 4 years before 9/11. It has not gone away at all. From a Rumsfeld-type perspective, this is an added reason for, in a sense, adding to the fear factor and say we're in for a long war. But the idea that, quotes, the war on terror as it has been fought has been successful is clearly a nonsense in their own terms. And then finally you look at what has happened in Iraq itself. Now the reality there is that what began as rapid regime termination turned very quickly, after all the chaos of the first few weeks, into an occupation which has proved to be incredibly difficult to counter. And it is worth just remembering again, over what is now nearly 3 years, the many occasions in which we've been told that the insurgency was about to end. July 2003, just a few months after the termination of the old regime, Qusay and Uday Hussein were killed in Mosul. That would be the end of the insurgency. 3 weeks later, there was the bombing of the UN headquarters in Baghdad. In October 2003, we were told that the insurgency was down to just a handful of extended families. The US forces knew who they were, and they were basically about to remove them from the scene. No change. In December 2003, Saddam Hussein was detained. We got him. That surely is the end of the insurgency. And so it goes on. The end of the Coalition Provisional Authority in July 2004, a partial handover to an appointed Iraqi administration. The insurgency would die away. It didn't. And then towards the end of 2004, everything became constrained on Fallujah. Fallujah was the locus of the insurgency. If that city could be taken over and, quotes, cleaned of insurgents, that would really knock the heart out of the insurgency. Fallujah is important for many different reasons, and it's worth again reflecting on what happened there and its impact. Looked at from an American perspective, a mainstream American media perspective, what you had was very considerable force, about 14 or 15,000 US with some Iraqi troops taking over the city following a very major assault. And you had all the television cameras, remember, showing the munitions pouring across the river into the city, the mosques being destroyed and the rest. And certainly within 2 weeks, the city itself was more or less taken over by US and some Iraqi forces. In the process, an honest assessment is that something like 4,000 to 5,000 people were killed, and the majority of those were civilians, certainly not insurgents. You turn the whole thing around and see it from the position of, say, Al Arabiya or Al Jazeera, the various satellite news channels, and you actually see the city of mosques under siege, mosques being destroyed, people being killed in cold blood. That would be the other way in which you would see. Add to that the DVDs, the websites, and the rest, and you actually get a very powerful argument, a propaganda basis for Al-Qaeda and the wider movement. And essentially, perhaps the thing to reflect on is that within 6 months of Fallujah being taken over by American and Iraqi government forces, the city by the summer of 2005 was actually completely surrounded by troops. There were only 4 entry and exit points. All males between the age of about 10 and 60 were searched going in or out. The city's population was less than half of what it had been before, so it was completely controlled. Within that city, car bombs were still being manufactured. In other words, even in the highest levels of security, it was not possible to actually contain the insurgency. And so it has been since. And if you look at what has happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the wider war on terror, well, we know that about 2,500 American troops have been killed, a far larger number seriously injured, maybe 9,000 or 10,000, and in total, nearly 35,000 American troops evacuated back to the United States for combat or non-combat injuries or physical or mental ill health, 35,000 in 3 years. The civilian casualties have been hugely higher. At the most conservative estimate, at least 35,000 civilians killed in Iraq and at least 5,000 to 6,000 in Afghanistan as well. About 70,000 people have been detained worldwide. At any one time currently, 15,000 are in detention. And there has been torture, rendition, and all the rest. In other words, what has happened is a very determined war on terror, which, frankly, is not working as expected or as intended. And the extent of the problems now facing the United States are really quite extreme. I think one must understand the nature of the insurgency in Iraq at the present time. It is still largely directed against occupying forces. There are very strong elements of intercommunal conflict, particularly since the tragedy of last week. And according to the Washington Post, over 1,000 people have died in the last week, far higher than the figures being given out by the United States or the Iraqi authorities. But what I think one has to appreciate, and I think one must do this, is the environment in which the American soldiers are actually fighting. Because what is happening is you get these young people who are pitched into an urban guerrilla war for which they are not ready and largely not trained, and they're facing a situation in which when they're out on patrol, at any time they could get a bomb going off or get fired on. And it's worth saying also that they are very well protected with body armor and the rest. They have the highest standards of battlefield medicine. But what this means is that many more people are surviving with very bad injuries than would otherwise happen. So you're having thousands upon thousands of young men and women who are getting groin, throat, neck, and head injuries, surviving, often losing limbs, and their compatriots, their comrades in arms, get incredibly trigger happy. So the end result is that if a patrol is fired on, just 1 or 2 sniper shots, they'll reply with hundreds of rounds of ammunition or call in helicopter gunships to respond. One has to understand this, because that is the nature of the insurgency. And what the United States is now being forced to do, because it is proving so difficult to control it in traditional means, is by and large they're tending to withdraw their troops from patrol into major bases, and from now on the major counterinsurgency action will be done by strike aircraft and helicopter gunships. The helicopter gunship use is 5 times higher than it was just 9 months ago. But inevitably you get what is politely called collateral damage, which means more civilian casualties. It's against this background that we now come to the present position where within the United States there is a great deal of misgivings and in many ways a kind of popular opposition developing. People are very uneasy about what's happening to an extent which wasn't true even 7 or 8 months ago. And in fact, the mother of one of the people killed, you will have heard of her, Cindy Sheehan, who actually camped outside Bush's Crawford, Texas ranch during August, actually acted as a kind of lightning conductor for this kind of move. So I think there is something really happening very much in the United States. And certainly what is trying to happen in Iraq is the United States may well withdraw some troops in the run-up to the elections coming through in November, which are so important to the longer-term future of the Republican Party. But the end result of all of this, with the problems with this war on terror, the continuing guerrilla war in Afghanistan, and the very dire state of affairs in Iraq, is the question, is there a rethink now starting to happen? And the answer one has to say is, so far, no. Across the American body politic, a more vigorous debate, but within the administration, no. And in fact, this is where I come back to the point at the start, where the idea of a long war is now beginning to be quite embedded in American military thinking. And this, I think, is the environment in which we now exist at the present time. Before I conclude by trying to suggest what might be positive ways forward, I would just like to do one more thing, and that is actually try and put what has happened in a slightly longer-term perspective. It would be possible, for example, for the United States, and indeed for Britain, to decide to withdraw from Iraq. It would be quite possible for that to happen. And it will probably mean that the jihadist element in Iraq, the minority of people from outside, which is a small minority, might actually find that in many ways their enemy had left them, And for many of the insurgents opposed to the occupation, that too would tend to die away. And it might well be that in such circumstances, the Shia majority would have to do political deals with the Sunni minority to avoid a long-lasting civil war, because the reality is there had to be shared governance at some stage. Now, that might be possible, but I think the problem is there are three reasons why this may not happen. The first is that as far as the al-Qaeda movement is concerned, Iraq is an absolute gift. It is creating a combat training zone which could be good for them for decades to come. And there is no way in which the al-Qaeda movement is going to withdraw its activities or withdraw its campaign against the United States, the so-called far enemy, or against the Middle Eastern elites, the so-called near enemy. That there is there for the long term. And remember that if you look at the long-term political goals of the movement, they are measured in periods of 20 to 50 years, not the electoral spans of American presidents or indeed the parliaments under the British system. What about the United States side? Are there any particular reasons why the United States would not want to withdraw from a region? There are two. One, that dreaded three-letter word, oil. And one has to remember all along that there is a 30-year history of American concern with oil security in the Persian Gulf. It goes right back, in fact, to October 1973, the Yom Kippur-Ramadan War, and the first oil price hike. And it's gone right through Rapid Deployment Force, Central Command, and all the rest. Just think back to 1991. How was it that the United States could lead a very broad coalition with 600,000 troops and 2,000 aircraft into Saudi Arabia to actually expel the Iraqis from Kuwait? It could only do it because the airfields were already built, 5 or 6 times larger than the Saudis required, because at some stage the US believed there would be a conflict in the Middle East, most likely involving Soviet intervention. This was, after all, the Cold War. But oil has been crucial in American military thinking for the best part of 4 or 5 decades, and it's become more and more important as the United States becomes a more significant oil importer, and now, of course, China also is a massive oil importer. That is where the rivalry hangs out. And that alone is one reason why the permanent bases are being built in Iraq, and the United States is there to stay. Indeed, to turn it round, if the United States ever did withdraw from Iraq, I think many people on the American right would view it as the biggest foreign policy disaster in 40 years. And this is also why Iran is so important, because Iran is even more rich in oil and natural gas than any country in the Middle East apart from Saudi Arabia. And there again, it is a country which in a sense is seen as opposed to the United States. So I think that is one core reason why it's going to be very difficult to get the new thinking in. There is one other reason, there's not time to go into any detail on this, but one must also recognize is the very important role of evangelical Christianity currently in American politics, particularly Christian Zionism. And this means very strong support for the State of Israel and absolute opposition to the rise of any serious Islamic power in the Middle East. And that, I think, when you put that together with the oil motive, means that getting away from this is going to be difficult, but not necessarily impossible. And in fact, in spite of what may appear to be a pretty pessimistic analysis, I would claim it's realistic rather than pessimistic. I actually think that we're actually entering a period of extraordinary opportunity. Because essentially, the way that things have been done so far, the use of military force is obviously not working as expected. And in a sense, if you go right back to the transition from the Cold War to the post-Cold War world, in many ways, the way the military changed in the United States and in Britain and other countries was really, to use that lovely phrase of an American Navy captain, it was all about keeping the violent peace in the post-Cold War world, keeping things quiet, keeping the lid on things, lidism as it's been called. And essentially, where you have major threats to what you might broadly call elite interest, not just Western interest, if need be, you have to use force. And in many ways, that was hugely sharpened by the 9/11 atrocities. And I think the period that we may be entering into now is a period in which you can really engage in alternative security thinking. You can point to the fact that if you want real reason conflicts, you've got to look at the deep and deepening socioeconomic divide worldwide, the fact that more and more people are marginalized and know it, leading to more radical social movements, and that we are entering the era of environmental constraints, and essentially you cannot keep the lid on things. And in many ways, I think the war on terror is an early and pretty extreme example of trying to do just that. And because it is going so badly awry, I think now is the opportunity really to look to the future. And this, in a sense, brings us right back to that incredible person, Olof Palme. Because if you go back to the Palme Commission report, back, in 1982, 24 years ago, you actually see in the context of the East-West conflict the kind of thinking, the kinds of demands for common security that we are desperately in need of now. Actually, people working together in their common interests. What has perhaps changed is now that has got a planetary context beyond the immediate East-West context. And what now comes in is the global issues, and particularly climate change and other environmental constraints. What it means is that we have to do much more intensive thinking, arguing, debating, and say we've got to develop better ways. And I have to say that if we're going to do that over the next 4 or 5 years, which in my view is the key period, we can do a heck of a lot worse than go back to the Palme Commission report and see how they approached that particular period of the early 1980s. Now, it is fair to say that if there was a talk on international security being given in this hall in 1982 or 1983, it really would have been pessimistic. With cruise missiles about to come into Greenham, with all the risks of an all-out nuclear exchange and a global catastrophe. We got out of that in ways which were quite unexpected. And I think we can get out of the longer-term problems that are beginning to face us now. It may even be in an extraordinary way that this almost knee-jerk response to the 9/11 atrocities is the last example of old thinking. If that's going to be the case, then it's up to people like us to try and make those changes. And as I say, a very good place to start is that report by Olof Palme and his colleagues. Thank you very much. If we look first at what you might call the Islamic right, it's worth just going into slight detail about what the aims are of the al-Qaeda movement. And they are really quite clear-cut, both in the speeches and the writings of bin Laden, Zawahiri, and others. And essentially, they have short-term aims which are measured over, 10 to 20 years, get all foreign forces out of the heartland of the Islamic world, particularly starting with the Kingdom of the Two Holy Places, Saudi Arabia, get the replacement of what is considered to be the corrupt, pro-Western and unacceptable keeper of the Two Holy Places, the House of Saud. Beyond that, the downfall of all the elite regimes in countries such as Kuwait, Jordan and Egypt that are basically part of the Western plot, as it's seen. Al-Qaeda has embraced the Palestinian cause, somewhat reluctantly, and certainly on the part of the Palestinians. Most Palestinians do not want to be embraced by Al-Qaeda, but essentially it has. And essentially you have the movements in southern Thailand and elsewhere which have informal links. There's all that plethora of short-term, quite distinct political aims. There is the longer-term aim, obviously, of re-establishing some sort of Islamic caliphate, which will be radical Islamist rule, rather like the Taliban, but writ large. And essentially, that will be seen very much in the context of responding to what is seen from these people's views as an Islamic world which is being encroached upon by the West. In other words, it is not, in any sense, an Islamic world rampant from their point of view. It's an Islamic world on the defensive fighting back. That is how they see it. It is worth just noting that this idea of the caliphate is, it's rather akin to trying, as Philip Lewis said, trying to re-establish the Holy Roman Empire. But it is worth saying that, of course, the Christian Zionists actually see Israel and its future place in Christian eschatology as really something akin to the Holy Roman Empire. So it's not just on the Al-Qaeda side. And it's also worth noting that if there was ever one reasonably sustained caliphate of any period, it was the first, the Abbasid Caliphate, in the very first, 100 to 250, 300 years of the Islamic era. And essentially, that was the period of the greatest flowering of architecture, medicine, algebra, and the rest. Where was it centered? Baghdad. So essentially, it is so easy from that perspective to say the heartland of the historic Islamic Caliphate is now, what is the phrase, occupied by neo-Christian Zionist forces after Arab oil. And you can see it very clear, after Islamic oil. And you can see very clearly now, it's worth remembering that this is a small minority within the Islamic world who take this very hard view, a very small minority. And it's also worth remembering, though, that there are more people who do feel on the receiving end. And one is bound to say that having 70,000 detentions, 35,000 or 40,000 people killed, actually adds to that. and it's a very powerful force. Your second point, as far as what you might call the hardline responses, not just in Britain, but in many other Western countries, and indeed in other countries across the world, including countries like Malaysia, in many ways I think governments are using this fear of, quotes, terror to really enact much tougher laws. I think it can be counterproductive as far as minority communities are concerned. It may eventually be counterproductive as far as majority communities are concerned. But that is a trend which is still very clearly underway. I think it's partly because counterterrorism historically has always been about countering terrorism, not understanding its causes, not understanding where it's coming from and how you actually have to undercut it in terms of the very support. And I think because we are stuck with this old kind of thinking, then that does encompass these harder rules of law, which I have to say I think are going to be deeply counterproductive.
The British Army used to be very proud, particularly in the anti-communist campaign in Malaya after the war, and certainly in Northern Ireland, of its ability to understand the local scene and respond intelligently. Have we lost all that?
I think Northern Ireland is very interesting. I mean, many people would debate the different ways the British Army worked, but what you cannot exclude is the fact that in that whole 30-year process, there were other political programs underway, which basically amounted to the slow but steady emancipation of the nationalist community. And that actually was very important in undercutting the support for the more radical movements. So I think that's actually quite a significant lesson. What I think is really quite significant is the way that you hear word of real unease within the British Army at the present time, both in terms of the Iraq deployment and particularly now that they're going into Afghanistan. I was talking to somebody who's due to go quite soon who was expressing this, and it's clear that that is actually, it is very strong among the British Army. It doesn't come through in the public except from some retired people, although it's very interesting that the first Sea Lord, I can't remember his name now, who retired only 2 weeks ago, while he was still in office, delivered an astounding warning about the dangers of going to war with Iran while he was still a serving officer. So that gives you an indication of the unease there is within the British military at the present time. China and India are experiencing very rapid economic growth. The social problems in China are extreme. There are thousands of demonstrations against inequality in China at the present time, very few getting recorded outside the country. So yes, China may well make it, but there's big question marks over social stability. And that one has to remember there are many oppositional movements, violent opposition movements in India as well, which again we tend to rather forget about. And I think while there is rapid economic growth, it's rather like the world writ large. In China, 1,100 million people, maybe 200 million are doing pretty well, but the rest aren't. And whether that can be changed, I think is going to be a marker. Let's say that does happen. And in fact, China does succeed in that way. What is the response of the American right? It's actually quite schizophrenic, because the more traditional Republicans believe that the main role of China is to be a grade A trading partner, very good for US business. The neocons see it as a threat. And the two have an uneasy relationship. I was at a conference in London a couple of years ago where a traditional Republican right guy was asked, you know, must we not arm ourselves against China? And he said, look, I'm not a neoconservative, I don't think like that, let's trade with them. So I think that there are two different things playing out in the United States, but what is undoubtedly true is that a lot of the focus is going to be on the Persian Gulf. And the Iranians have been incredibly clever at this. They've done these huge deals with India, but more importantly with China. $75 billion 20-year deal for oil and gas supplies to China. China wants that, it wants the deal, it wants close relations with Iran, and that's for one reason why you will not get serious UN sanctions under any circumstances against Iran. Now, the paradox there is that if the United States cannot use that kind of vehicle, does it make it more likely that it may use military force? And that's a big question mark.
Yeah, Paul, you mentioned the end of the Cold War as reducing the likelihood of nuclear exchange. I think what we're more worried about is that the Americans won't risk the use of ground forces in Iran, but what they have talked about is a preemptive nuclear strike. And I think this is really, what are your views about that?
one would hope and think that it would be out of the question, but I'm bound to say that the woman who's the head of the Middle East Studies section of the Heritage Foundation did write a piece in November saying that at some stage the United States would have to use deeply burying nuclear weapons to destroy the Iranian nuclear facilities sometime in the next few years. And that's from a hard right-wing source, but one with a great deal of influence. I think there is the risk that we are not out of the nuclear age. It now looks like the United States is going to develop a range of new, smaller, specific devices. Britain is likely to replace Trident. The French have been giving, Chirac in particular, giving much more belligerent speeches recently. The Russians, now that they have some degree of economic gain, are going back to rejigging their strategic weapons, and the Chinese are modernizing as well. I think there is this risk of what are called small nuclear wars in far-off places. And once the threshold is broken, we survived the first break-in in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We survived the Cold War only just. Remember, we now know much more clearly how dangerous that period was, even worse than those rabid CNDers were saying at the time. I mean, some of what is now coming out about the crises is quite incredible. Crises we didn't even know about. So that, I think, is important. But in a sense, I think in the Cold War, there was the risk of going over the abyss into outright nuclear annihilation. Now we're on a slippery slope. And it's actually more difficult to warn about and more difficult to campaign against. And the risk is that small nuclear devices at some stage become usable in particular wars. And once that happens, then proliferation will never be controlled. There will be a far greater push to get wider proliferation, and we will be in an extremely dangerous world. I mean, I go so far as to say that if you want the Iranians to put all their efforts into making nuclear weapons as quickly as possible, attack them now. Because the immediate response will be to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and use every effort they can to get what they will see as a deterrent.
Paul, you know, 20 years ago, Olof Palme died because he was showing quite severe opposition to what was coming out of America. But 25 years ago, the Greenham Common protest took off in this country and showed enormous opposition to the sighting of cruise missiles here. And what I think we really have to understand is the arrangements that were made at the end of the Second World War that have tied us into the illegality of American warfighting. The mutual defense agreements that we sign every 21 years, which hardly anybody really knows about unless they study this in depth. And what worries me is that we are not encouraging people in this country to really take a stand and oppose the American bases that are here now. We're hearing in America that they're very upset because Bush has ordered the interception of communications against Americans, and they're very upset because of their constitution. But we have the base at Menwith Hill that is intercepting every single thing every person in this country does, every day of the week, all the time. And we're not being encouraged to stand up and really put opposition in the front of the American bases in this country. And it isn't coming out of the academic institutions. I mean, you're giving an analysis which is very good, but there is no encouragement to people to withstand the pressures that are here and now. And that really concerns me.
I would certainly agree about the academic side. I mean, there are so few centres which do the independent work. I had the privilege or not of being chair of the British International Studies Association for 2 years recently, which is the sort of the professional body for international relations scholars. And what you see there, and I was the program manager for 2 annual conferences with 400 or so participants, is so much of the work was dry, traditional, and uncritical, bluntly. But there were exceptions, because one of the things that was established 3 years ago was a network of activist scholars for politics and international relations, researchers, young people who actually were not prepared to really just get the old stuff coming at them without any real critical appraisal. And that has grown hugely, and there are now hundreds of people involved in that. But I have to agree with you, I think the academic community has a lot to answer for, because people who work in universities are among the few people who still have freedom to actually do independent research. And it's their duty to do really good critical work. I also agree with you very much on the issue of the American bases and the way in which, I mean, the example of Lindis Percy and the attempts to put an ASBO on her, just a few months ago, and the problems that Lindis and Annie and the other campaigners at Menwith have had. It is extraordinary. I will say one thing, though, and that is that if we actually head to a crisis with Iran, the United States will require British assistance, require it, because it will have to use the B-2 stealth bombers. The only places they can operate from outside of the United States and Guam are Diego Garcia, which is a British territory, and Fairford in Gloucestershire. Those are the only two bases in the world outside of the United States and Guam where the facilities exist, and they're expensive facilities for these planes to operate. So if there is any crisis developing, you can take it as read that the British government will be required, well, let's be kind, requested to ensure that there is a participation in that way. And I rather suspect that if it was to come to the crunch, there would be a very strong movement of opposition across Europe. I'd even go so far as to say that, in a sense, all that campaigning that people were doing in 2002 and 2003, leading up to the 15th of February, were, in a sense, a failure because they did not stop the Iraq war. They may yet be the start of something that stops the Iran war. On the question of costs, there just wasn't time to go into everything. I agree with you on that. The costs will be gigantic. And in fact, the Bush administration is just asking for another supplementary increase for Iraq and Afghanistan, which I think is going to be another $60 billion. And that's on top of the new defense budget, which has just been announced, which takes the United States defense spending right back to the peak Cold War days. If you add the cost of these two wars, then it's wildly exceeding the highest levels of the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. As far as Iran is concerned, I think you can make a very strong argument for how dangerous it would be to start a bombing campaign against Iranian nuclear facilities. There could be all kinds of comebacks, including gigantic oil price rises, Iranian interference in Iraq. Certainly the Iranian government itself, which currently has a maverick president in my view, but essentially is also quite popular, would increase hugely in popularity. I was in Tehran fairly recently. We've had some very good Iranian doctoral students through my own department. I talked to some of them while I was there, and they said the one thing you have to understand is this idea that if there was an attack on Iran, the regime would fall apart, is an absolute nonsense. And these weren't people who supported the current government. They said what you would get would a unification. What shook me, actually, the Oxford Research Group published a paper on this, which I was involved with 2 weeks ago. And as a result of that, I did a program for Israeli National Radio last Friday week. And the interviewer, who's very sharp, very on-the-ball guy, he said, well, there is the very common view in Israel that if there was any kind of attack on Iran, the regime would fall apart, you would get regime change. And he said that really is a dominant view in Israel at present. And I said all I could say was I think it is absolutely and completely wrong. And you could have heard a pin drop after that. There is this view that Iran can be, quote, sorted out. No way. And you have to approach the difficult problem of the proliferation of nuclear weapons in very different ways if we're going to actually prevent a potential crisis in the next couple of years. It depends largely on who we are and why we're doing it. There may well be arguments under particular circumstances, very much under the broad UN banner, for intervening in some way in the face of absolute human outrages. Rwanda was a possible example. There may be others. What I'm very dubious about is that what is actually done in the guise of such intervention usually has other motives. I do not believe that Iraq had regime change and occupation basically because of the nature of the Saddam Hussein regime in terms of his responses to his own people, brutal though these were. I think it had much more to do with his position in terms of longer-term security interests of outside powers, including the United States. But I would say this, the question of intervention in other countries is extremely tricky. There may be circumstances in which it could be acceptable, but I think you've got to be very careful, and it has to be done by broad international agreement with every other method tried first. One of the extraordinary things in Iran at the present time is there is a kind of almost a schizophrenia in the sense that Iranians know full well that the Americans terminated the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which was not popular in Iran, and they've terminated the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq, which was even less popular. And essentially, from that point of view, the Iranians can feel somewhat satisfied, and there may well have been manipulation. The Iranians have been very careful not to openly interfere in Iraq. They could do so, but they haven't done so. But the other side of this almost split view is they now find 138,000 American troops in Iraq, another 50,000 in the Gulf states. They found the United States and NATO building an air base in Herat, just east of Iran. They have the Fifth Fleet with carrier battle groups controlling the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, and they've been declared part of the axis of evil. So at the same time, there is a great deal of uncertainty and fear. The two are mixed in together. I don't myself think that the Iranians, as of now, are seeking specifically to develop nuclear weapons. They certainly want the technology to enable themselves to do so if they wish. They may not go further than that. What can we do about it? Well, I mean, I think the first thing is to be as knowledgeable as we can on what's going on. I would say basically to take the argument that the way this whole war on terror has been approached, both in terms of the military actions in Iraq and elsewhere, is deeply and persistently counterproductive. And we've got to work it out almost from square one. If you want to turn the whole thing around, then obviously the various things that can be done by different people at different levels, obviously any kind of work for a just settlement between the Israelis and Palestinians. It's not core to Al-Qaeda, but it is a running sore across the Islamic world. Certainly far greater improvements in human rights and movements towards democracy in countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and elsewhere. Genuine help, which I think has to include a much larger stabilization force in Afghanistan to try and help that country make the transition. And at the wider level, when you get into the big picture, we have to address the core global issue of growing inequality, because that is at the core of so many of the problems. People who may not be uneducated but are still marginalized. And you see it in so many radical social movements across the world. I'm not pretending it's not a huge job, but I mean, we're all in it for life, so we better get on with it. I do think that if there was any kind of attack on Iran, either by the Israelis or the Americans, it would be disastrous in all kinds of ways. For a start, once you take military action, you can't stop. Diplomacy between the United States and Iran, which doesn't exist now, could not exist for the next decade or more. The Iranians would be bound to do their best to try and develop some sort of deterrent as quickly as they could, which means more bombing raids. They would react to what the Americans had done. There would be far greater unity. You then turn around and say, well, surely this is enough to make sure that people in Washington will come to their senses. But if you remember, there were people even at the US Army War College and people within the State Department saying you do not do Iraq the way you're intending to do it 4 years ago. No notice was taken of them. It's a question really of making the loudest voices possible. And I do think, in fact, that countries such as Germany and Britain may be significant here. It is well known, there's no disguising that the Foreign Office in Britain is very, very dubious about any move towards military action against Iran. Whatever Mr. Blair's views are, that may be something different, and he may call the shots, literally as well as figuratively. But essentially, there are divisions within the British government. I think it's hugely important to make it clear how dangerous such attacks would be, because it might just be possible to prevent them happening. At least it's worth a try now. I mean, all you can say is there has been a change in American domestic politics over the last 7 or 8 months, since the Cindy Sheehan thing provided the focus. I don't know where or how far that will go. I think you can just hope that it will lead to a wider debate about American role in the world. If you're interested in a very good website, check out the Project on the New American Century, then check out the website which is called the Project on the Old American Century. It's smashing, it really is. It's a very good counter. And also, the other great site, I think, is Unconfirmed Reports, a marvelous parody website all about what's happening in the United States. And as long as there's that degree of humor, I think it's good. And there's that lovely American joke, which I gather is circulating at present. George Bush's response to bird flu is going to bomb the Canary Islands. To go more seriously on Hamas, I think it's very significant to see how the Europeans are trying to wriggle on this one. They know full well that if economic support is withdrawn from the Palestinians, it will be chaotic. It's probably what the current Israeli government wants, not everybody in Israel, because there is quite a powerful movement in Israel from the left now. It's beginning to develop again. I think the Europeans are actually pretty determined to try and see some sort of transitionary process. It's well known in Brussels that Hamas is evolving quite rapidly at present, just as Hezbollah is evolving quite rapidly. But if you're actually insisting on they change their charter now, they will not do so. I think there is a chance that we might actually get a more rational approach to what is happening in Palestine. The difficulties, of course, are that if you were to actually get a democratic transition across the Middle East, one of the end results will be democratically elected governments coming to power in which the United States will be the first ones out. And I think this isn't realized. Somebody said quite acidly, remember when the Turkish parliament refused to allow the US to go into Iraq via Turkey? Somebody said, well, you can kiss goodbye to the idea of democracy across the Middle East. It goes out of the window faster than you can say the words Turkish parliament. And essentially the trouble is democracy is a two-edged sword, if it is genuine. I remember that lovely comment, I think it was the American ambassador to Wellington, at the time of the New Zealand nuclear ships controversy in the 1980s, when the New Zealand government under David Longy wouldn't allow American Navy ships into New Zealand harbours because the Americans wouldn't say whether or not they were carrying nuclear weapons. And the New Zealanders really got up the nose of the Reagan administration. And the American ambassador made this lovely comment, almost in despair. He said, it's so much easier to deal with Asian dictatorships than with messy democracies. I think you've got to be incredibly careful about banning groups like that. In fact, I think the whole question of banning a wide range of groups can be extremely dangerous because I think it can be deeply counterproductive. You just put people underground. I'm glad what you said, what you did about the strands within Islam, because yes, there are a whole range of strands. The group that look to a more violent transition to a caliphate basically represent a very small minority. A rather larger group sees this ideal as something to be worked for in other ways. And many more people across the Islamic world do see themselves, in a sense, on the receiving end, and they really need to express themselves more strongly. What I think the problem is that if among Western populations, among Western politicians, you have the idea abroad that essentially these are people who want to actually convert the world to Islamic caliphate, that is unacceptable. But on the other hand, you have, 30 million Christian Zionists in the United States who believe that Israel is God's given land, given as a dispensation to the Jews, that at the end days all the believers will be taken up to paradise in rapture. Christ will come and rule the world for 1,000 years, centered on Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has to be preserved for that purpose. And that essentially that we will then have the final day of judgment. This is a deeply held religious belief. It's as deeply held as people who believe the caliphate must be re-established. And it seems to me that if you have any belief in religious freedom, then you've got to allow those views to play out and to be debated and to be argued. And I think it is very easy to say the Islamic world has these extreme views when you forget about some of the views which are held by your own people, your own constituents. And within the United States, while the Christian Zionists may only represent maybe a minority of evangelical Christianities, support for Israel is far greater. The evangelical Christian lobby is far more significant than the traditional Jewish lobby in supporting Israel. The Jewish lobby is much more split because of many liberal Jews in the United States are very dubious about the policies of the Sharon government and its successor. But I think there is a real case of beams and moats here, and I think banning organizations which do not demonstrate a clear-cut threat to individual people can be very dangerous.